Hello YouTube, welcome back to the garage. As you can see, I've decided to join the COVID-19 Home Haircut Club. Yeah, not exactly the best of efforts. Certainly won't be looking at a career in hairdressing in the future. But the good news is it's certainly low maintenance, I'll give it that. You'll be pleased to hear there has been quite a bit of progress on the little CB-400 track bike. Unfortunately, most of it has been cleaning, sanding, painting. In fact, behind the camera there's various brackets all hanging from the ceiling with paint drying on them as we speak. So I didn't think that's the sort of thing that would make very interesting footage, so I've decided to drag this little CB-1 out. Now, I was using this little bike up until sort of the end of November last year, and I'd always intended just to use it every now and again over the winter, just for the odd weekend ride out. But as so often happens, life got in the way, and the poor little thing ended up shoved in the garage. I didn't winterise it, so it's been sat with the old fuel in it. And like so many bikes that have enjoyed a hibernation, this one, as you can see, is proving to be a little bit reluctant to get going again. So, as there seems to be quite a few people posting comments on Facebook and the various forums that they are struggling to get their bikes running again after the winter layoff, I thought it might be a nice interesting little video just to go through all the various steps that I take on one of these bikes to get them up and running again. So, I'm going to take the tank off and the seat off, maybe remove a few panels just so you can see the various bits easier, and then we'll come back with the first point, which is the battery. If the bike's been sat for a couple of months, chances are the battery will have lost some charge. You may have put it on a trickle charger, but if, like me, you've just literally left it as it was, there's every likelihood that the battery will have lost the charge. So the first thing to do before you even start is we actually need to check the voltage of the battery. So I've got my multimeter here. We're just going to put the dial onto the volt setting and connect the terminals across the battery. And you can see I'm getting a reading of about 12.2 volts. Now that is actually a little bit lower than you really want. Anything less than 12 volts, the battery will definitely need a recharge. If after charging it, it still doesn't get much more than 12 volts, then I'm afraid you're looking at a new battery. So we can eliminate the battery. It should have enough charge to get us going. If not, I do have another battery and we can always just hook that up. The next thing to check is the kill switch. Now, if you haven't been caught out by a kill switch before now, I guarantee at some point in your biking career you will. The other thing with these particular little bikes, which makes life very confusing, is even with the kill switch in the off position, the starter motor will still turn over. So it's quite easy to sit there cranking the starter and wondering why the hell the bike won't start. Try the kill switch. Like I said, this may seem a really simple step, but you'll be amazed how often it gets overlooked. Modern fuels tend to have a relatively short shelf life. In fact, they usually tend to go off after about 3 months. So for that reason, if you're ever storing a bike for any long period of time, you really do want to remove all the old fuel. Now in this case, this bike's been sat for nearly 5 months with some old fuel in. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to drain. I've disconnected the fuel tank, removed the fuel tank, and now we're actually going to drain all the old fuel out the carbs. Underneath each carb there is a drain screw, which is just here, and the fuel will flow out of this little nipple here. So I've removed the clutch cable just to make life a bit easier. What you want to do is you want some sort of container. It needs to be something quite small. Now I don't know where I got this from, but something like a paint tin lid or anything of that nature will do.
and we just want to put it underneath the carb and then undo the drain screw, and you should see some pretty horrible fuel flowing out. And we need to do this on each carb. So finish draining that one, tighten the drain screw back up again, and then move to the next carb along. Now unfortunately there's not a huge amount of access under these bikes, so I'll probably end up getting my hand in the way, but let's give it a go. Okay, so that's the two carbs from this side. I'm going to stop you for a minute, go round and drain the fuel from the carbs on the other side, and we'll be back in a second. Okay, I've gone round each carb, undone the drain screw, drained the old fuel out, made sure the drain screws tightened back up again, and I've gone round with a bit of rag, just wiped up any spilt petrol. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put this rag underneath the carbs, so that if we do get any spillages or leakages when we come to refill them, the rag should hopefully catch them. So just literally lay your rag underneath the engine, ready to catch any spilt fuel. The other thing that's worth checking, it's a good idea to check your fuel filter. Now you won't see that from here, but I shall bring this one over and you can see this particular fuel filter is full of rust particles. So that doesn't bode well. If there's rust in the fuel filter, it means obviously I've got a rusty tank, and it's very likely that some of that rust will have found its way into the carbs. I don't know how well you can see it, but there is definitely some nasty gunk and rust collecting in the bottom of that filter. So at the very least we're going to need a new filter. Okay, so I went out this morning, bought myself some fresh fuel, and you really do want fresh fuel. Make sure it is literally fuel that you only bought within the last couple of days. And now we're just going to manually prime the carbs. So take your fuel line, and you can either feed it through the pump, but it's often a good idea to actually bypass the pump and just prime the carbs directly themselves. And I'll talk a bit more about the fuel pump in a minute. So I'm going to undo this connector here, and this is where the hose goes from the fuel pump to the actual carbs themselves. It's quite nice on the CB-1 because it is nice and accessible, whereas I think on the NC27 you don't have this particular brake, and you do actually have to take the hose off the fuel pump itself. So I'm just going to use a little funnel. I'm going to pour some fuel in. You don't need a lot, literally 100 millilitres, maybe 150 millilitres. It doesn't take a lot to fill up the float bowls. It also helps if you can get the bike as upright as possible. Now, A lot of CB-1s have lost their centre stands over the year and have only got the side stand, so what I've done is I've put a few pieces of plywood just underneath the centre stand to try and level the bike off. Okay, so yeah, that literally took 100 millilitres. If you need to put more than 100 millilitres in, then there's every chance that the fuel is pouring out the bottom of your carbs. So let's just have a quick check. Make sure our rag isn't soaked, and I'm just going to get a torch and have a quick look underneath, see if I can see any drips. So far, so good. Now, if you do find that there is petrol coming out either the bottom of the carbs or out the two overflow tubes here, it usually means you've got a sticky float. Now, sometimes you can get round it by taking the end of a screwdriver and just tapping on lightly on the float bowls, and that might be enough just to unseat it, and then you can try putting a bit more fuel in. If they're still leaking, then I'm afraid the only option is to take the carbs off. Now, just to be on the safe side, I am just going to quickly reconnect that. Also, it's a good idea at this stage to disconnect the fuel pump, because obviously we've got nothing connected to it. Now, the lead for the fuel pump is down here by the negative terminal of the battery. So I'm just going to disconnect it. Of course, it's in the most inaccessible place behind another relay. There we go, I've disconnected it. So this way, when we do turn the bike over, the fuel pump won't be pumping any fuel anywhere, because of course there will still be some residual fuel in the main feed from the tank. So, turn it back on, give the bike a little bit of choke. Okay, I'm going to try putting a little bit more fuel in, give it one last try, but it doesn't look like it's just the carbs. So, okay, so we're just up to the top of the tube. I'm just going to wipe the fuel off my hands. Again, check underneath, make sure there's no obvious leaks. It certainly helps if you've got to put your torch and just have a good look underneath. Make sure there's no fuel coming out where it shouldn't. And we'll give it one last try, but I think our problem is not just carbs. So the next thing we need to check is to see if we've actually got a spark. So I'm just going to take this bit of rag out the way, and obviously the spark plugs on CB1s are notoriously hard to get at. We have to take this cover off in order to get at them. So I'm going to stop the video for a second and we'll look at spark plugs. Taken the cover off, now we can get at the spark plugs. So I'm going to check the condition of the spark plugs. We're also going to test one to see if it is actually firing. Whilst you're here, it's also a good idea to make sure you've got the plug leads in the correct order. So what you should have is one coil will fire the spark plugs on cylinders 1 and 4, and the other coil will fire cylinders 2 and 3, the two central cylinders. Very easy to get them mixed up, although obviously the leads are quite different lengths. It has been known. The other thing to check is the actual connections to the coils, which are round here. And just to confuse matters, both coils will have a black and a white lead, and that is your power feed. And then the coil for cylinders 1 and 4, that has a yellow wire with a blue tracer on it, and the other one has a blue wire with a yellow trace on it. So yeah, quite easy to get that confused. So just check that while you're at it. Now, as this was running before I put it in storage, I'm fairly confident, and I haven't messed around with it, then I'm fairly confident that the plug leads are correct and the coil connections are correct. But if you've had the bike apart for any reason, it's a really good idea to check that. Alright, so there's my spark plug. Looks pretty clean. Does actually smell quite dry. So normally if the petrol is getting through from the carbs and you're not getting a spark, the plugs will be quite wet and you can really smell petrol on them. This one smells a little bit petrol-y, but it's quite dry. So let's put the plug lead back on the spark plug. And then what I want to do is I want to find somewhere where I can earth the spark plug against the frame. So I think that's as good a point as any. And hopefully, if I turn the engine over now, let me do something so you can see it better. You can hold onto the plug leads with your hand. It's not going to give you a particularly nasty shock, but I prefer not to. So I've got some heavily insulated pliers and we'll try again. And hopefully you can see there, I'm getting a fairly clean spark. Whilst I've got the spark plug out, I'm just going to go and check the gaps, give it a clean and see where we go from there, and do the same to all four. If you weren't getting a spark, then a handy little thing to do is you can actually unscrew the plug cap from the lead, and what you'll find is in here there is basically a very small stud, a bit like the end of a wood screw, and inside the HT lead there is a central cable, and what you do is you actually screw the plug cap into the lead. Now over time that connection can go awry and the cable starts to fray. So if you unscrew the plug lead, take it off, cut about 5 or 6 millimeters off the end of the plug lead and then screw the cap back on, that will give you a really good connection and ensure that the plug cap is properly connected to the actual leads. But as I said, we're getting quite a nice little spark here, but but what I'm not getting is a particularly petrol-y smell. So I don't think it's the spark plugs on this. Yeah, I'm getting a nice clean blue spark. So I'm just going to take all the plugs off, give them a clean, re-gap them, and it looks like in the case of this bike we're going to have to take the carbs off and give them a bit of a clean out. So I will come back a bit later on. As you can see, I've taken the airbox off purely because it gave me better access to the spark plugs. So I've taken each spark plug out, I've cleaned it, re-gapped it and checked to make sure it was sparking. I've checked all the plug leads to make sure they are properly connected. And that was all fine. Now the interesting thing is the middle two plugs were wet and the outer two were totally dry. So that brings me back to the theory that there is probably something wrong with the carburetors. Whilst I was doing all the spark plugs, I gave the battery another little charge just to bring it back up to full power. So there is one final thing I'm going to try, and what we're going to do, I've got a little bit of petrol in this paint cap, and I'm just going to pour a tiny drop, about a teaspoon's worth, not even that, in each carb, and we'll see what happens. Now I don't know if you heard that, but it certainly sounded a lot more willing to fire up. Right, so put a tiny drop of petrol in each carb, gave it quite a bit of throttle, and as you can see it starts. So that proves my theory that I'm going to take the carbs off and give them a bit of a clean out. To be honest, given the state of the fuel filter, I'm not surprised. I'm expecting to find quite a bit of rust and muck in there. So I'm quite pleased with that. At least we know what the problem is now. But having actually got it started, I'm going to try and see if we can get it to run through the actual carbs. So let's just reprime them. I'm going to reconnect the fuel pump. Which really is in the most inaccessible place they could put it, this connection. And there's not a lot of slack on the lead. Okay. Now I'm going to get my auxiliary fuel tank. So, what is an auxiliary fuel tank? Well, basically, it's a small remote fuel tank you can use, which won't get in the way like the main petrol tank. Now, I've made this one up using basically an aluminium sports bottle that I bought from the pound shop. I'll do a quick video on how to make one of these. They're so handy, especially if you're balancing carbs or adjusting the mixtures on the carbs. Worth having in the workshop. Now I just need to get some more petrol. And then we can fill the remote tank up. Now this particular tank doesn't have an inline fuel tap, so when you're filling it with petrol you really need to make sure that the actual bottle itself is lower than the connection. That way any fuel you put in it won't start running out of the connection until you actually raise the tank up into position. So that's about half full, which should be more than enough. And I'm just going to lift the tank up and attach it to this very handy ladder that I've got hanging up. And that now brings the tank up higher. You can see it there. Brings it up higher than the bike, so we've now got a gravity feed system. So let's try it again. So it's definitely running. What I do need to do is put the airbox back on, because they really don't like running without the airbox. So I'm just going to basically put the bottom half of the airbox and the filter on, which should give the carbs the impression that the full airbox is on. And now the bike won't be running so lean. I think I'm going to have to accept that the carbs are going to have to come off, and we are looking at a strip down and a clean of the carbs. But at least we've managed to establish what the actual problem is. So I'm happy with that. So I'm going to go away, clean the carbs. I think you've already seen the video for that one, hopefully. And next time you see this bike, it should be running. I'm also going to go through some of the other common problems that people get. So I've been lucky, the starter motor worked, there was power where there should have been, but sometimes people will find that that isn't the case with their bikes. So I'm just going to run through some of the common causes of those. But yeah, I will disappear now, but I'll do a quick addition at the end of this video just to prove that I did manage to get the bike running. So see you shortly. Well, it's the following day. I've stripped down, cleaned and rebuilt the carbs. They've had a good dose in the ultrasonic cleaner and a good spray of carb cleaner. And I've refitted them. In fact, I actually had to refit them twice because the first time I routed the cables incorrectly, and it is almost impossible to get the cables off these carbs without taking them off again. But we're all here, so now for the moment of truth. Genuinely haven't started this up until now. So let's see if stripping and rebuilding the carbs has paid dividends. So the first thing I'm going to do is I just need to manually prime the carbs like we did when we were testing it. So got my little funnel, and I'm just going to pour a bit of petrol straight into the carbs. And as I said before, the reason for doing this is the pumps on these bikes are absolutely useless at self-priming. They don't like operating with an airlock. So by priming the carbs manually, what you're doing is ensuring that the petrol is already there and that there isn't an airlock. Also, just a quick check underneath, make sure there's no fuel leaking anywhere where it shouldn't. Okay, and we're there. So just reconnect that up. I'm just going to go and grab some rag to mop up the spilt petrol. So the carbs are all connected back up to the fuel pump. We know the fuel pump's good on this, so I'm not going to bypass it this time. I am going to run the fuel through the pump. And what I am going to do is use my little remote tank, because I suspect we will need to balance the carbs properly. I did bench synchronise them, which should get us pretty close, but they're obviously going to need a final little tweak with the carb synchroniser a bit later on, and I'll do a quick video on balancing carbs after this. I've got my remote reservoir connected up, and then we'll fill it, or at least half fill, 3/4 fill it. Just tie it off to the left hand handlebar so it's a little bit higher than the pump. Okay, final check for unwanted fuel. Looks nice and dry under there. So here we go, the moment of truth. Running nicely. Just check each of the exhaust pipes in turn to make sure they're all getting equally warm, which means it's firing on all 4 cylinders. And I think we can call that a success. Idling quite nicely. settled into a nice even tick over. So if anything, it's a little bit low on the tick over, so we'll just up the tick over speed a bit. But yeah, I think we can call that a success. Even when you rev it, it settles down to a nice gliding. So actually, I think we've got close enough with the bench synchronisation. But if there is enough interest, I will run a video on how to synchronise the cars. So, after all that, I think all that's left to do now is take it for a test ride. I mean, go and get some essential shopping on it. Thanks for watching. Hope that helped, showing some of the common problems. But I know I didn't cover a lot of the stuff. So I'm going to do a second video, and we're going to look at, whilst the body works off it, we're going to look at some of the other things that can cause you problems. So I'll see you in the next video. Thanks a lot.